Good afternoon, morning, evening, whichever time you've chosen to sit in on the next lecture. So for this lecture, we're going to talk about bacteria and bacterial infections. And bacteria are my favorite organisms on the entire earth. They're just amazing. They're just completely amazing. So anyway, let's get to it. So just to review slightly, bacteria are microscopic single-celled organisms. They live almost everywhere, on every surface of the earth, on animals, on people, on plants, dirt, oceans, everywhere. And they perform many vital functions for the earth and for many of the organisms that live on the earth. And an example of this is how many bacteria live on us and how many of them are actually helpful to us. So you might recall that in the human GI tract, we have bacteria who help to digest food, and they help to break down and help us to absorb certain vitamins, which is very beneficial to us because we wouldn't get them any other way. Um, and then they also provide a bit of immunity, like again, in the GI tract, your intestines or whatever, and also in your throat and on your skin. They are very prevalent, and so they help to prevent microbes from infecting us in those areas. Okay, so the beginning. Bacteria, for a long time, 3 billion years, were the only living organisms on Earth. So imagine that, 3 billion years and it's just bacteria. But their contribution was huge. And that's, what eventually led to the Earth we have now. So Dr. Martin Blazer, who wrote a book called Missing Microbes. Here's his quote. They made the oxygen we breathe, the soils we till, the food webs that support our oceans. Slowly, inexorably, through trial and error across the deepness of time, they invented the complex and robust feedback systems that to this day support all life on Earth. So magical organisms. Love these guys. And they're really interesting too. So I hope you will enjoy them as much as I do, or at least partly as much as I do. So bacteria occupy, let me move this over a little bit. Bacteria occupy most of sorry, I'm just changing it, most of the tree of life, which is basically the evolutionary relationship between all living things. So if you look on this diagram, you can see starting at the upper left, there's some blue organisms, and those are E. coli, or representative of E. coli. And then as we go around the circle, those are all kinds of different species that have evolved in different ways. And then as we go around, we get to the purple, and that is another type of bacteria. So all of that entire lower 3/4 almost, or maybe more, of that tree of life circle is bacteria. So you can see how many thousands, millions of species there are. Then you get to the red area, and that's where most of the things we know about live. Their DNA is represented in that small area. So humans and corn are are more closely related than humans and bacteria, or even two bacterial species. So quite amazing. And then the small blue area is the archaea, which are unique small single cell organism that are eukaryotes as well, but resemble bacteria in some ways. So humans are just a very tiny point in this massive bacterial world, and microbes also occupy most of us, as we've talked about. So let's talk about how they infect us and what they do to make us sick. So even these bacteria, the ones that make us sick, I like them too, but only because they're clever, if there is such a thing as clever in a bacterium. So, but first, there's some bad things. So, bacterial skin infections. You've probably known someone or even had a bacterial skin infection. There's several of them. There's folliculitis, there's cellulitis, impetigo, boils. All of these are a bacterial infection. Bacteria get into or under your skin, and they start operating their machinery, and they cause some issues. So folliculitis is when they infect your hair follicle, and that can be anywhere on your body, not just on your head. And they form kind of swollen bumps that look like pimples. Impetigo, which is the image that you see on the right there, causes oozing sores, and those are they're kind of a yellowish drain, and they also look very kind of crusted when that yellowish material dries up. And boils are deep infections that start in the hair follicles, but you might get a pretty big lump. Like my daughter had one once. I think it was about a half an inch to an inch in totality. So like a half inch or so. That's just a solid mass, and those need to be removed. So all of these respond to antibiotic treatment, orally or sometimes topically. Then we also have several diseases that are foodborne. You've probably heard of salmonella, and you find that in raw meats, particularly chicken, fish, eggs, poultry, lots of unpasteurized dairy products. I always talk about my kids and some of my experience. So when my daughter, I was a microbiologist before I was a instructor. And so my daughter was, gosh, my youngest was probably about 2 years old, and our garbage was in the garage because it was uncovered, and I didn't want uncovered garbage in my house. And so one day I went out to the garage, and she followed me out, I guess, or my other daughter went out. She went out with her, but anyway, she comes walking in the house with that kind of absorbent pad that's in the bottom of chicken. And she's got that as she's sucking on it. Oh my gosh. The microbiologist in me just freaked out. Immediately called poison control, the ER, her personal doctor, just like, what should I do? Should I get her on antibiotics? But they're all basically, no, not unless you get something. So anyway, she recovered. She didn't ever actually get sick, but boy, it grossed me out. Probably grossing you out too. So you can also get salmonella from unsanitary food preparation, and the bacteria that cause some of these gastrointestinal upsets, of course, are salmonella. There's a more evil one, which is Shigella, which causes, more feverish and just a worse kind of disease. Shigella usually is treated with antibiotics. Salmonella is just self-limiting. So after a couple of days, you're feeling okay. And all of them cause fever, diarrhea, and abdominal cramps. And then we also have some sexually transmitted bacterial infections. Some common ones are chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis. Well, actually, syphilis is not well, it is. It is, I guess. It's a bacteria. Sorry. And then there's several other ways that we can get bacteria, or other areas where we can get bacterial infections. The most serious is probably bacterial meningitis, and that's when the lining of your brain becomes infected, or your nervous system actually gets infected, but the lining of your brain swells, and you have bacteria in there doing all kinds of nasty things, making toxins and other chemicals and stuff that causes severe illness. And you've probably heard of otitis media, which is an ear infection. A lot of kids have those. And then UTIs, very common to have a urinary tract infection. Typically, it's a bladder infection. More serious is a kidney infection. And then probably every single one of you has had some form of a respiratory tract infection. Most of them are viral, but you may have had strep throat or a sinus infection, or even pneumonia, which is infection in your lungs. But those are some of the bacterial infections that can arise, some of the common ones, I guess. So what is the disease process? How do bacteria actually cause us harm? They use motility, as we mentioned before. All of these should be reviewed. They use motility and some other means to connect to host cells. And once they adhere to those host cells, it's hard to remove them. And then they start to compete for nutrients, and they also may produce enzymes which attack the host cells or the host tissues. And sometimes they are resistant to immune defenses. Remember, they might have a capsule, or they might have some external structures that prevent our immune system from recognizing them as a pathogen. So, like I said, kind of clever. How do they kill us? This tiny, minuscule, only under the microscope thing, how can that sucker kill us? Well, they can on their own, but typically it's complications from the bacterial infection that kill us. But what they do is they multiply very rapidly. Our reproduction cycle is, 15, 20 years, 30 if you're whatever, if you're a late bloomer. But bacteria, they can reproduce an entire generation in about gosh, some cases every 15 minutes. So they grow very rapidly, it's exponential growth. And they will crowd out some of the host cells or even some of the host tissues. And in doing so, they may kill some of those tissues or cells and can disrupt the function or the mechanism of action of some of those tissues. And so by doing that, then you're losing some critical mechanisms in your body. They also can produce toxins. I think I mentioned that before. Some of these toxins can actually paralyze you. There's two common ones, which we'll talk about: botulism and tetanus. You should have gotten a immunization or a vaccine against tetanus when you were younger, but it's important to get them every 10 years because vaccines do fade and tetanus is not a nice disease. So anyway, some of these toxins, they paralyze, or they can also destroy a cell's metabolic pathway. When they destroy the cell's ability to, do all of the life functions, then the cell dies. And if enough of those die, then some of the cells, will affect the tissue and the organs, whatever. And then the final way that bacteria kill us is not their fault. It's our fault. So we create a massive massive immune reaction. So you remember fever, well, just the inflammation, first of all. You have fever, you have swelling, you have pain, and those, if you get a high enough fever, it can actually kill you. They always talk about in the old westerns or other long ago eras, did he survive the night? Yes, his fever broke. Well, fevers did used to kill people, so that's the reason for that. I mean, now we think of a fever, we take some Tylenol or some ibuprofen. If it stays around long enough, we go to the doctor, we might get some antibiotics. So it's not as serious as it used to be. But also some other things that happen is the bacteria can secrete a lot of different enzymes. You might recall, I think it was in the last lecture, yes, where they have all kinds of different types of enzymes that can affect us. And some of those cause cell death. And some of those chemicals might also trigger what's called intravascular coagulation. And basically, that means your blood is coagulating, but it's coagulating inside your body, so inside your veins. And that can kill you because, your phagocytes and everything is trying to, get all of these bacteria. You're starting to form some small clumps. And then when the chemicals arrive and create more mayhem, then you can just enter this cascade of clotting inside, and that can kill you. So our immune system is really trying to take care of us, but in this case, it just goes a little too far. All right, so there are many infectious diseases that resolve without complications. In the old days, they didn't have antibiotics, so you either died or you recovered. But here are some current life-threatening complications. So obviously dehydration, if you have a GI infection, you might have fever, vomiting, and diarrhea that lasts a long time, or even not a long time, but you lose water so quickly that you can't get enough back. You can't drink it or whatever because you're vomiting, or you just don't feel like drinking anything. And then if you have a respiratory illness, even if it's viral, you can still get a bacterial infection secondary to that, and you can get a pneumonia. And you can also just get a plain old bacterial pneumonia. And then sepsis is a condition. They also call it blood poisoning sometimes, which is not really a good term for it. But sepsis is when the bacteria actually enter your bloodstream. And so the bacteria are all over, and you are very sick. If you've ever had a UTI or strep throat, you don't feel good. And that's like this much of an area where you have bacteria. If you have bacteria all over your entire body, you're going to feel really bad. And you can imagine the fevers and, all of that comes along with it. So sepsis is very, very deadly disease, or dangerous disease at least. And that can occur with any kind of infection if it gets into your bloodstream. So like if you have an ulcer and, bacteria get in there, or, you get perforated intestine, or belly wounds in the old days used to be the worst because you have so many bacteria in there that you were toast essentially. um, and then meningitis, I mentioned that, where you get swelling of the brain, and there can be different causes of that as well. And then we also know HIV, which is not a bacterium, it's a virus, but there is complications, which is AIDS. And then some other viruses, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, human papillomavirus. Those are just in this table, so I included them here, but they can cause some other diseases too. But we'll continue on with bacteria for now. All right, so before 1940s, you remember we talked about kind of the history of disease and the germ theory and all of that. Remember, they didn't even know what caused infections until the late 1800s, and antibiotics were not discovered or developed until the 1940s. I mean, there was some information in the early 1900s, but that was kind of just a discovery period, not that they were able to make them into pills or liquids to treat people. But as I mentioned earlier, if you got a bacterial infection that was untreated, you either recovered or you didn't. And for instance, I've listed strep throat here, which you actually could die from if you believe it or not. But from strep throat, you could get otitis media, an ear infection. You could get your sinuses infected, some other serious ones, or you could get rheumatic fever, where your body overreacts to this strep bacteria, and it gets all your tissues inflamed, like your joints and your heart, cause a heart murmur, and yeah, it can be serious. And then scarlet fever, which is you have a bright red rash. Interesting side note: the Velveteen Rabbit. The kid who was in that book was theoretically recovering from scarlet fever. So just a little tidbit of info. Okay, so a German biochemist just before World War II discovered the antibacterial properties of sulfanilamide, which he extracted from red dye. So he realized that this had antibiotic properties, and he had tested it on bacteria and some other things, maybe some small mammals or something. But his daughter got ill, and she got very, very ill, and she got ill from sticking a needle, having a needle stuck in her hand. I imagine it's a pretty big needle because it went through her wrist, and obviously she got a bacterial infection, and she was on the verge of death, and he secretly injected her with this sulfanilamide, and she recovered and lived happily ever after, I guess. But anyway, he did receive the Nobel Prize for medicine for that discovery. And he was German, but scientists do not usually withhold information from the world when they have an important discovery. So the United States learned about it, and I actually have one of these little metal tins. What this is a metal tin in a little container. This looks like burlap, but it's actually like a canvas. You've probably seen army belts or whatever. Anyway, inside this tin is a little packet of powder, and that powder is sulfanilamide, which this German fellow discovered. And so if you were in World War II, you carried this on your belt. And if you got a wound, you were instructed, if you were able, to open up the packet and pour it in your wound. Because in the Civil War, I think we covered this, you were just as likely or more likely to die from infection than you were from the actual injury. And the same is true in most wars. You're out in the muck, and there's lots of yuck out there. You have bacteria on you, and when something penetrates your skin and gets into your deeper areas of your body, you do not want bacteria in there. So this helps until you can get treatment from a medic and or shipment out to a hospital. So how do antibiotics work? Well, there's tons of them. Drug companies discover antibiotics or create antibiotics all the time. Many of them are related, but and they all pretty much follow three basic mechanisms of action, or three targets. So you might remember that bacterial cells have a cell wall, but we don't. So the bacteria, a great antibiotic target is to prevent that cell wall prevent the cell from creating that cell wall or destroying that cell wall somehow. And so that's one of the mechanisms of antibiotics that's currently in use. The second is inhibiting the machinery that makes their DNA or their RNA. And their DNA and RNA is different than ours. Well, in many cases it is, or parts of it are. So theoretically, antibiotics can target that bacterial DNA or RNA. And then they also produce proteins and ribosomes. We don't really cover that. But anyway, they can target the protein synthesis. So by taking away their cell wall, preventing them from forming DNA, preventing them from forming proteins, then the cell is going to just die. And so you have some antibiotic, and slowly, as the bacteria reproduce, the next generation, like you have, let's say you have 10 bacteria, and theoretically in 15 minutes, they're going to make 20 bacteria, and then 40 bacteria, and then 80 bacteria, et cetera, or even more than that. But so if you have 10 bacteria and this antibiotic is floating around, then they can't make that that next generation. Well, if you have 1,000 of them and you have this antibiotic, then it's going to prevent some of them. It's going to get them right at the right time when they're trying to produce their proteins or their DNA. But some of them have already gone past that level. And that's why you take antibiotics for usually 7 days, 3 days, 7 days, depends on what antibiotic you're taking, because you have to catch each generation as it starts to reproduce. And then that eventually kills everything that's in there. So most of these targets, as I've mentioned, are structurally or different than in humans, or they might be absent in, for example, the cell wall. Okay. So now the bad part, antibiotic resistance. So you may have heard that there are bacteria that are acquiring resistance. And this is due to several factors. I'm going to just kind of cover the main two. And the first one is when we're taking an antibiotic, then it's going to kill most of those bad bacteria, but there may be some that, just a few, that are able to reproduce, even though there is antibiotic in there. So they'll continue to grow and to reproduce. And so then when they have been exposed to multiple antibiotics, they can acquire resistance that way. So they do this by mutation. So as they're going through their life cycle, just like us, there's sometimes a mutation. And since their reproductive period is so quick, they're much more likely to have mutations than obviously we are. Our only chance is every 20 years, but theirs is more like every 20 minutes. So they have several more mutations. And one of those mutations can be they lose the function or the structure that the antibiotic is attempting to attack. And so then they become resistant. The next way is called horizontal gene transfer. And you remember plasmids? So what happens with plasmids is, actually, let me talk about that in the next slide. But gene transfer, there's like 3 or 4 different ways where gene transfer can occur. Believe it or not, there's viruses for bacteria. And so if a virus goes jumping into one and then to another, just, it can transfer some DNA in there, and it can transfer some of that DNA resistance. But the most common way is via conjunction. And this is bacterial conjunction. You might remember some bacteria have a structure called the conjunction pilus or pili. And this is where you have 2 bacterial cells up here. The one on the left has a plasmid. The one on the right does not have a plasmid. They both have chromosomes, though. So then they attach their conjugation pili, and then they're kind of like hanging out together. And then you can see in the third image down, you can see that plasmid has reproduced, and it's sending some of that sending all of that plasmid DNA over into the new cell. And plasmids very often have antibiotic resistance genes on them. And so this is one of the primary ways that bacteria can get resistance. So again, multiple use of antibiotics and then conjugation. Those are the 2 primary ways that bacteria develop resistance. Now, the bad part, again, antibiotic resistance is becoming major threat, and that's probably because of the overuse of antibiotics and antibiotic products. So on the left, you see urgent threats. So Acinetobacter, that's a, well, I'm not going to talk about it. It's just a bacterium. And then there's Candida, which is a yeast, Clostridium difficile, which causes severe diarrhea, and then Neisseria gonorrhea that causes gonorrhea. So some of the gonorrhea species are resistant to antibiotics. So you don't want to get that gonorrhea, right? And then these are, by the way, these are all from the 2019 World Health Organization list of antibiotic resistant threats. So some more serious threats, they're not quite, as dangerous right now, but they soon will become. So Campylobacter causes a diarrhea, enterococci, it can cause a UTI, it can cause all kinds of infections. Pseudomonas aeruginosa, am I talking too fast? Probably. Pseudomonas aeruginosa, that is commonly found in showers and hot tubs and any place where it's really warm and moist. And then we just talked about salmonella, and salmonella causes a GI upset. Now, if you get an antibiotic resistant salmonella and you can't get over it, guess what? The rest of your life, which will probably be shortened, you're going to be having salmonella. And then the one below it, Salmonella serotype typhi, that is a disease that causes typhus, which is a very serious, can be very serious, more serious generally than the GI salmonella. And then Shigella, which is also bacteria, GI system that causes severe diarrhea. Staph aureus, you might have heard of this one. Some people call it MRSA, or some people call it MRSA. And what it stands for is methicillin resistant Staph aureus. You don't have to know that. Just know that, it's methicillin. No, don't even know that. Just know that resistant staph is called MRSA or MRSA. And we have staph on our skin. We have it in our nasal cavities. We have it many places. And so if you get an opportunistic infection with that, then that could be very serious. An opportunistic, you can get it in your skin, your hair follicles, lots of places. And then streptococcus, which causes strep throat, that too can, it may become very serious or an urgent threat. Pneumonia and tuberculosis. We'll talk about tuberculosis later on and how it was a very serious disease for a very long time, and we really don't want tuberculosis to become antibiotic resistant. So there are drug companies that are working on creating new antibiotics for some of these that are resistant, but we can continue to use antibiotics appropriately and inappropriately. So we've got to really curtail use of antibiotics in inappropriate situations. Then on the far right, there are some other concerning threats. These are not quite as serious yet, but they could become so. So as I mentioned, the use of antibacterial and antimicrobial products may produce strains of multi-resistant organisms. So that's not just antibiotics, that's antibacterial products. Antibacterial and antimicrobial products are actually no better at eliminating bacteria than regular soaps, regular detergent, and warm water. Washing your hands with warm water and soap for 15 to 20 seconds is the best way to prevent bacterial infection. Well, any kind of infection, but we're talking about bacterial right now. Now, I'm going to show you a list of a bunch of antibacterial products, and it's ridiculous. So soap, I'm sure you've seen dish soap, antibacterial Dawn, or soap, just regular soap that you use, hand soap, hand lotions, window cleaners, cleaning cloths, surface sprays, toothbrushes, mouthwashes, toothpaste, garbage bags, plastic bags, makeup brushes, feminine hygiene products, kids' toys. It's embedded somehow in the plastic, fabric, carpeting, deodorant, plastic containers. So, like as you put your leftovers in, glass containers, same thing. Metal railing, like some grab bars, they advertise them as being antibiotic resistant. Light switch covers, the things that you put over your light switch, those little plastic things, they have antibacterial products in them, some of them. So all of these are useless. These are actually harmful. Because what these do, you remember you have a bunch of normal flora here, and that normal flora helps keep out the bad stuff. So if you're using all these products, you're killing your normal flora as well as your bad bad flora. But if you kill a lot of your commensal or your good bacteria, if you have a one resistant bacteria on you, that's the one that's going to grow because you've killed off the good stuff. So these are actually harmful. So I would encourage you to not use antibacterial anything because it's creating a disaster waiting to happen in the next few to many years somewhere down the line. Okay, so avoid using antibacterial and antimicrobial products unless you're advised to do so by your doctor. Now, this is different than like when we were using hand sanitizer for COVID. That was kind of a general warning by the FDA, or excuse me, by National Institutes of Health to make sure that you cleaned your hands. And if you couldn't wash, hand sanitizer is really the next best thing. But you don't need to use it every single day of your life, just when you're protecting yourself from a pandemic disease. All right. So that pretty much covers basic biology, and we're going to move on to plagues. We're going to start with bacterial plagues, and then we'll move into some of the other ones. So see you next time.